Right. I'm just gonna come out and say Resident Evil 5 is one of my favorite games in the franchise. Now I know, for some fans it's quite contentious, but frankly, I don't care. I find this game way too much fun to play to care about any of the numerous criticisms it receives. And Resident Evil 5, of course, is the direct follow-up to Resident Evil 4, one of the most influential games of all time. So, Resident Evil 5 had some pretty big shoes to fill, and for some people it did, for others it didn't. Either way, it's easy to say that regardless of what you think of Resident Evil 5, it borrows heavily from Resident Evil 4 in gameplay, structure, and controls. Resident Evil 4 speaks for itself with it being available on every major console since its release, with each release being shockingly competent and worth playing no matter what system you own. That being said, there is one version of Resident Evil 4 that sticks out amongst the rest, and that would be the Nintendo Wii version. This version can be played like all the others if you use a classic or GameCube controller, but should you choose to use the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, then you'll have access to exclusive motion control aiming that makes the Wii version of Resident Evil 4 the best version amongst many fans. Now I know not everyone cares about motion controls, and that's okay, but for shooters, I genuinely believe motion controls improve the experience. Having motion control aiming in Resident Evil 4 really does make the game more fun to play, if a tad easier due to the additional accuracy. Now the only other version that comes close is the recent VR version. I did buy a MetaQuest 2 to play it, and I can say it's a great time for hardcore Resident Evil 4 fans. However, since VR is a whole different beast and not as accessible, I would still recommend the Wii version for playing Resident Evil 4 with motion controls. Regardless, any version of this phenomenal game is worth checking out. With that having been said, and considering just how similar Resident Evil 5 is to Resident Evil 4, it's only natural to hope for similar style motion control aiming that was present in Resident Evil 4 on the Wii. Thankfully, there are several options to play Resident Evil 5 with motion controls, but unfortunately none of them quite hit the mark. There's the PS3 version using the Move and Navigation controller, the PC version with keyboard and mouse controls, and the recent Switch version which added gyro. Now before I would play on PC with a keyboard and mouse mapped to a Wii Remote and Nunchuck since that seemed like the best approach. Unfortunately, it only amounted to a neat novelty at best and a frustrating load of jank at worst. You see, Resident Evil 5 was never designed for a Wii Remote, and it really shows in practice. The PS3 version with the Move controller, I did play a lot, and you know what? I'll say it scratches the itch when I want Resident Evil 5 with motion aiming. Conceptually and in execution, it's pretty much exactly like how Resident Evil 4 on the Wii played. The only thing to consider is that the Wii and PS3 use completely different technologies in order to achieve a cursor-style motion control scheme. See, the Wii uses infrared technology, which I believe is self-explanatory to most people nowadays. Setting up the sensor bar is as simple as it gets, and the results are instantly satisfying. The PS3 is a little different. Both the PS3 camera and the Move controller work in tandem in order to achieve a cursor on the screen, and the results are quite different compared to a Wii. See, the Wii, for the most part, only uses the infrared sensor to track a cursor around a screen, which doesn't require any calibration, keeps the cursor confined within a boundary around the screen, and provides fast motion input. The PlayStation Move controller mostly uses a gyroscope, which will lose calibration over time and won't have a boundary like how the sensor bar had, so the cursor will only appear center on the screen while you aim. Now, gyroscope motion feels different than infrared, and in the case of Resident Evil 5, there is a small amount of delay, and sensitivity can seem a little off. Basically, the point here is that if you're going to play Resident Evil 5 with the Move controller on the PS3, then you need to go in with a different mindset than what you would have playing Resident Evil 4 on the Wii. As similar as they look, they feel quite different, so you'll just have to get used to it. One bit of advice I can give is to use lower sensitivity settings than what you might want, as the gyro motion can get very jittery when using higher sensitivity settings that might otherwise feel closer to how Resident Evil 4 Wii felt. Like I said, you just need to have a different approach when using the Move controller. Look, in the end, if you want the official Capcom implementation of true Wii-style controls, then this is your only option, which I'll stress isn't a bad thing, it's just different. If anything, you'll probably have a harder time going back to the lower resolutions and frame rates of the PS3 version. Man, wasn't it exciting when Capcom announced that they were going to add gyro to Resident Evil 5 on the Switch with the Day 1 patch? Because the Switch has already proved it can do a cursor on the screen with the Joy-Cons, and it feels good. This was totally gonna make the Switch version the best one to play, right? Of course not. It still uses the laser, which I know for some people they'll prefer, but in this application it just feels bad. Okay, it's not super terrible or anything, but don't expect better accuracy results when using it. From what I understand, the gyro still uses analog stick inputs, so it's prone to dead zone and the sensitivity never feels right. Aiming is fine enough for broad movement, but not for actual precision. I still played the shit out of this version despite not having much interest in it, but don't let the added motion controls be an enticing selling point. Now, I was still interested in the PC version of Resident Evil 5 since it actually has a cursor aiming scheme for keyboard and mouse. Even though using this scheme with the Wii Remote and Nunchuck didn't have the satisfactory results I was hoping for, I didn't want to give up hope just yet. It was pretty clear that using a Wii Remote was just too much of a hassle to get set up and the results aren't worth it. Like I said before, Resident Evil 5 was never designed for a Wii Remote, and it really showed. Luckily, it can be remarkably simple to mess around with controller configurations thanks to Steam's controller software. I've added motion controls to several games thanks to it. Now it's just a matter of how to get Resident Evil 5 to have Wii-style cursor aiming controls using Steam software. Now at first I thought about using Switch Joy-Con controllers as that would be the closest way to emulate the feel of a Wii Remote and Nunchuck. However, I'm unable to reliably connect a pair of Joy-Cons to my PC. So it's something to fiddle with another day. For now, I'll demonstrate how I use a DualShock 4 for my personal configuration. Oh, and before we proceed, I must insist you get the quality of life patch that's available for the Steam version of Resident Evil 5. This patch does a lot to boost the appeal of this version, and if you're going to mess around with controller configurations, then it's pretty much essential. So, as you can see from my controller profile, pressing the right trigger switches the controller to output as a keyboard and mouse to aim. I have the keyboard inputs mapped to their appropriate spot on the controller so there's no confusion when playing. So the cursor appears on the screen while you aim, and it's all handled with the controller's gyroscope. Surprisingly enough, it somehow feels way better than the PS3 version. I'm not sure if it's simply because of the performance boost of playing on PC, or if gyroscope technology has simply gotten more advanced since then. Either way, the cursor here doesn't have any delay like the PS3 version, and the motion is very smooth and responsive. On top of that, it's surprisingly comfortable with the DualShock with two hands, which I wasn't expecting, to be honest. To be completely real with you, this is the best aiming configuration I've played for Resident Evil 5, and when hopping through different versions of the game, this configuration led to the most accurate aiming compared to all other versions in my experience. It gets extremely close to perfect, keyword being close. Despite how good it feels to aim this way, it still isn't an official implementation, so there's gonna be some issues that get in the way of playing. Any issues all have a solution to them, but nothing to make the experience completely seamless. These issues are also subject to be fixed with new updates of the quality of life patch I mentioned before. I will happily have this video be outdated should the things I bring up be addressed in future updates, but for now I want to express them here for the sake of consideration and demonstration. The first thing I want to bring up is rather minor, and that's how you won't have any rumble functionality when playing the game this way. This is just something that's different for every game, so some games will still output rumble when using keyboard and mouse as long as a controller is connected, but unfortunately Resident Evil 5 isn't one of those games. So since we're technically using keyboard and mouse inputs when aiming, we won't have any rumble functionality, which may be a bummer for some, and I'll admit I do miss it every time I go without it, but that's just me. QuickTime events have always been an issue for crazy controller configurations like this. Since the right trigger is mapped to a mouse command, instances where the trigger needs to be pressed for a QuickTime event will be quite troubling to say the least, and it can be tricky to think of solutions for this issue especially. For moments of QuickTime events during gameplay, I used to have it where the right trigger would still function normally when pulled halfway. This wouldn't be possible on Switch Joy-Cons as they don't have analog triggers. For the DualShock, you could comfortably perform most in-game QuickTime events as long as you press the trigger halfway. It also meant if you wanted to switch back to the laser with the analog stick, then you could do so on the fly. However, I discovered a unique issue from this that I'll explain later. For cutscenes, I have it where by clicking the touchpad on the DualShock, it'll revert the controller to a standard gamepad with no keyboard and mouse inputs being accessible with any of the buttons. You'll need to play in big picture mode within Steam just to get the on-screen notifications to let you know when the switch happens, by the way. This is ideal for cutscenes so you won't have to worry about pressing the trigger lightly, since cutscenes yield greater risk of failure as you'll have to watch the cutscene again and no one wants to do that. Then once the cutscene is over, you can revert back by pressing the touchpad again. Now my theorized solution that would make QuickTime events a complete non-issue is by disabling them outright. Newer versions of Resident Evil 5 lets you toggle the QTEs a bit and disabling them completely on easier difficulty settings. So if disabling QuickTime events can be patched into the Steam version, then it wouldn't be an issue anymore. Only time will tell. Okay, so even though I expressed that the cursor with gyro feels amazing, it's not completely free of jank because the game doesn't like to swap input types on the fly like this. What I mean here is that, for some reason, the last aiming position you were in with keyboard and mouse is saved once you revert back to it. So what can happen in practice is you'll aim high with the cursor in the corner or something like that, and then you'll stop aiming to play the game normally, only to go back to aiming at the corner or way up high once you choose to aim again. This just feels weird, and while I've yet to run into a fatal situation from this little quirk, it's still undeniably awkward. I thought I could mitigate it a bit by having the cursor center on the screen every time you aim, just like how the PlayStation Move handled it, but I couldn't get it to work. Steam has a cursor positioning feature, and for Resident Evil 5 it works perfectly within menus, however for aiming it doesn't work. Now, I'm not technically savvy enough to understand why, but from what I can get at, aiming in Resident Evil 5 has different input registers compared to other instances like menus that makes custom cursor positioning impossible. I remember reading about something called mouse acceleration that's supposed to smooth cursor movements in Resident Evil 5, which does feel good, don't get me wrong, but it makes external configurations like this more challenging. My current workaround for this is simply having the right analog stick function like a mouse as well. So instead of the cursor having a center button, you'll manually move the cursor with the right stick and then aim as you would normally. Works fine enough, but again, doesn't feel too professional. Now, while writing this script, I discovered what made this issue even worse is using an older setup with normal aiming being usable by pressing the trigger halfway. For some reason, if you switch to keyboard and mouse while aiming with the laser, the game reacts in this weird ass way where the camera goes back to where it was when mouse aiming. However, if you switch to keyboard and mouse at a standstill, then the camera won't reset to where it was before. The cursor will still be in whatever position it was on the screen, but at least the camera won't bug out. Now, unfortunately, the camera anomaly would naturally happen with the analog trigger, as when pressing, it'll start as laser aiming, then revert to mouse aiming, causing the camera glitch. So in updated configs, I disabled the analog and the trigger to prevent the camera from spazzing out. This, of course, makes the right trigger completely inaccessible, which can make QTEs challenging once again. Luckily, my solution is a pretty simple one. So right now, my current workaround is having the bottom face button momentarily disable the motion aiming config when being held down, then re-enabled when released. I tried other buttons like the left trigger and other face buttons, but none of them quite worked so well. So for QuickTime events that use the triggers, you'll just have to hold the bottom face button before you press them. It works fine enough, but I'll admit it isn't that great of a setup. There are a number of in-game QuickTime events that can throw you off because the keyboard inputs will appear on the screen, and it's hard to tell what the corresponding button inputs will be and pressing them before the QTE window ends. Honestly, the only thing I can recommend at this point is memorizing when in-game QTEs appear and disabling the gyro aiming config with the touchpad. It sucks for it to be this way, but that's just how it is when you're setting up an unorthodox controller configuration like this. For as much as I praised how good the cursor felt on PC with the DualShock, I'm still going to say the PlayStation Move controller is my favorite way to get the RE4 Wii style aiming controls, just for consistency, reliability, and it's easy enough to set up and play. All the cursor and QTE issues I brought up may have a workaround to them, and you could find much more elaborate guides that might work for you, but I find there's always a trade-off. You could probably have a more consistent experience if you choose to map all of your controller's buttons to keyboard and mouse, which would solve all the issues that swapping input types has, but I could never get comfortable looking at keyboard prompts with the controller in my hand. Plus, for QTE issues, there's still the workaround of what keyboard prompt will be mapped to what controller button. After a while, I start to feel like a game developer when I just want to play the damn game. The only reason I went this far to begin with is because I love playing Resident Evil 5 so much, and most other games have it pretty simple when adding gyro aiming. Resident Evil 5 is just a much more difficult beast, and I'm a bit tired of trying to make it work perfectly. I think my current profile works fine enough for the most part, and there's lots to love when playing the game this way, but the small hiccups that persist hold it back from it being one of my favorite ways to play it. The PS3 version with the Move controller still works the best in my experience. Should there be any more updates of the quality of life patch, I'll be sure to try them out. Until then, I'll stick to playing on PS3. You know, I hear PS3 emulation is getting better and better, and honestly, I think a performance boost via emulation might make the Move controller feel way better, so we'll see. At this rate, only time will tell, and if you can't stand the poor performance of the PS3 version, then at this point, I'd say just stick to a normal controller. It was, and still is, the way the game was originally meant to be played, so don't fight it. Anyway, I think that'll be it for me today, so I just want to say thank you for watching.